So with chapters 10 through 14, we get into the kind of the nuts and bolts, if you will, of microeconomics when we start talking about market structures. So when we say market structures, we're talking about four basic market structures, and it's pretty straightforward here: pure or perfect competition. I prefer to call it perfect competition. Author calls it pure competition. And moving from there into monopolistic competition, and from there we go to oligopoly into pure monopoly. So we're going from perfect competition, which would be, you could describe it as like a farming type of agricultural type things. Think about it in terms of, I'll use this term, we'll hear this term over and over again. These are price takers, meaning that whatever the market price is, that's the price that they can fetch for their, that they can fetch for the goods or services that they're actually producing. So a farmer does not dictate the price of the corn that they sell. It's whatever that market price is on that given day, or depending upon the market, futures markets, etc. So they are price takers. They settle for whatever the price is, or they don't sell it. That's it. And if we moving from there to monopolistic competition, they are still price takers, but that would be more in the framework of like a fast food type of a restaurant, where they do have some price power or market power, if you will, but not a heck of a lot. And it doesn't last for very long. Whatever market power they might have or they exert, it does not last very long. Moving from there to oligopoly. Oligopoly is a Greek word, Greek derivation, I should say, where there are a few suppliers, the oligopoly. There are a few market participants, if you will. So that would be very typical in terms of large manufacturing operations, like an automotive industry would definitely be considered an oligopoly, for example. And there's quite a bit of representation of oligopolies within the economy. Moving from there to monopoly. Monopoly is pretty straightforward, and that is that you are, again, oligopoly moves into price maker territory, where you can kind of dictate prices more, obviously, than would be the case in terms of perfect competition or pure competition or monopolistic competition. So the oligopoly or oligopolistic manufacturer or firm rather would be is a price maker to a greater extent, much greater extent than, of course, would be perfectly competitive firms or monopolistically competitive firms. Finally, when we talk about monopoly, there are also price takers, price makers. So they dictate prices. Obviously, monopoly is the market is the firm, and the firm is the market. They're one and the same. So there's only one producer in that given market. All right. So let's begin with pure or perfect competition. So what makes a market perfectly competitive? We have to have a large number of firms with very close or identical products. They're basically clones of one another. They're homogeneous, however you want to phrase it. Potato, right? So they're pretty much the same being produced. Corn is corn, for example. All right. And there's ease of entry or exit, and I'll just read this off. As entry and exit occurs in these competitive markets, the market supply curve increases and decreases. When the equilibrium price falls as firms enter, the demand curve facing that firm falls, and some leave the industry. As firms leave and the supply curve decreases, shifts up, and, if you will, to the left, the market price rises and might trigger entry again into this market. This ease of entry and exit is very much characteristic of perfectly competitive markets, meaning that a firm, singular firm, has zero or very little influence over any market. So they are certainly price takers. Whatever that market price is, that's what they can sell their product for. And which, again, this ease of entry, ease of exit, there's that piece of it that goes along with it, so far as the being the price taker. And if there's some increased demand, if there's some fall off in market participants, it might drive prices up a bit. or end up with higher prices, might attract new participants in. Bottom line is that if there is some sort of price power, if there is some sort of market power to be had, it goes away very, very, very quickly, which again adds to this ease of entry and exit. So when we say a farm, of course, people would think, well, a farm is not exactly cheap, you know. A few 100-acre farm is not inexpensive. It's not, the farm implements are not cheap, right? So on and so forth. But where that ease of entry and exit really comes in is the fact that if you have this farm, you can pretty much easily sell it. You can get out of it pretty easily. You can buy a farm relatively easily too. Whether or not they're available is another story, but you get the idea. It's not that big of a process, not that big of a deal. And relatively speaking, even though we're not talking about, you know, small amounts of dollars necessarily, it's a transaction that's pretty straightforward, especially relative to other more complicated, more involved industries like an oligopoly for sure. So again, that's the ease of entry and the ease of exit. Once, if you want to sell your farm, you can sell your farm, and the day that you sign in the piece of paper, it's over and done with, as opposed to other types of markets where there could be some legacy costs associated with if you shut down production in an oligopoly. Example would be in South Bend, Indiana. It used to be the home of Studebaker cars. There are probably still some Studebaker pensions that are out there. People that have retired from Studebaker or spouses or whomsoever collecting still on these pensions. And so this is what we talk about, the not being so easy to exit, or of course to enter. It's very costly. Anyway, the individual firms then again have virtually no price power. They are price takers, not price makers. And the consumer surplus is maximized. And remember, the consumer surplus, as we've already talked about, is that triangle that it's bounded by the y-axis, the price axis, the demand curve, average revenue curve, and the actual price line, that triangle that's formed. And what we say is that the consumer surplus is maximized in terms of there being no excess being taken away from the consumers, meaning that there's in the virtually zero producer economic rent or producer surplus, excuse me. So that's the reference, if you will, to that consumer surplus. There's no economic rent or producer surplus, so you're getting the maximum amount that you can so far as consumer surplus is concerned. The criteria that it also meets would be in terms of what we call the welfare conditions. This is an economic term, welfare, in terms of welfare, and it's in how society overall is kind of treated. It's not in terms of welfare payments, benefits, etc. It has to do with the overall welfare, societal welfare. So the welfare conditions deal with efficiency and equity. In this case, efficiency, remember what we mean by that is that it's the biggest bang for the buck, meaning that you're producing the maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price, right? So equation-wise, we're looking at price is equal to marginal cost. So it's that point where marginal cost crosses price and where average cost is at a minimum. So all three of these come together. You're talking about the price point where marginal cost crosses through where the demand curve is at a horizontal demand curve, and where average cost is at a minimum. Average cost is at the very bottom, right? That's where marginal cost cuts up through it. All three of those points in order to meet that efficiency. Again, lowest possible price, maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price. Whereas equity, we're saying that's where the average cost is equal to the average revenue. So all cost, including opportunity cost, are under that cost curve. When we talk about opportunity cost, that's some small profit, just enough normal profit, enough to keep you engaged, to keep you providing your productive resources is really what it comes down to. So in a micro sense, we're looking at this is the perfectly competitive market where we have efficiency and equity. Those conditions are met, meaning that welfare, that economic welfare conditions are met. It's the same thing again. This can only occur in perfectly competitive markets. So that's in the micro sense. Macro sense, we'll be going over this several times. Macro sense, reduced bias toward inflation and recession, meaning that there tends to be less inflation because in order to have inflation, that's higher prices, right? So that prevents firms from raising prices because you are a price taker, right? So it really limits the ability of firms to raise prices, which, again, this is definitionally what we're talking about, perfect competition. And as a result of which, we also have a reduction in the occurrence and also the severity of recessions. Because again, when we're talking about in perfectly competitive markets, you are a price taker, not a price maker. And the quickest way to clear surpluses in a market, which is part and parcel of what happens when we start stepping into recessionary territory often, is that you reduce prices. The prices come down to reduce those surpluses, right? To reduce gluts, to reduce surpluses. So what that, of course, would mean is that there is less of a tendency toward that recession, and so the price adjustments would come into play. You wouldn't have sticky prices, but that's a macro topic. Anyway, you get the idea. So again, we're focusing on perfect competition, but this is also the case for all other market structures. And just at any rate, so surplus economic profit leads to entry of new firms. It's really what it comes down to. Surplus profits, which are greater than the firm's opportunity cost level of profits, again, called the economic profit in the text, mean that it is the best choice for the use of firm's capital. It is better than the next best opportunity. Remember, we're talking about the next best competitive choice, next best opportunity for the firm's employment of resources, right? So again, as the entry and exit occurs in these competitive markets, the market supply curve increases or decreases, shifts to the right for an increase, shifts to the left for a decrease, okay? So when the equilibrium market price falls, as the firms enter, the demand curve facing the firms fall and some leave the industry. So this is that entry and exit, how its market forces are at play to kind of drive that, if you will. As firms leave and the supply curve decreases, shifting upward and to the left, or to the left rather, the market price rises and might trigger again entry again into this market. Again, this ease of entry and exit is characteristic of perfectly competitive markets. So the takeaway from this is that while firms cannot dictate prices, the entry and exit of firms, which is, again, it's very, very easy for firms to enter or exit, but as they do so, the price has a tendency to go up or down. So if firms leave, that it decreases the supply, which causes that price to go up, which causes more firms to enter. And the counter to that is that when you have complete market saturation, you may reach the point where the price falls and people leave from the market, if you will. And so that shifts the supply curve again back to the left. We start back up again with the same idea. So again, to reinforce this idea of having no price power, no market power, the competitive firm or the perfectly competitive firm or purely competitive firm, they can't dictate prices. So using corn as an example, so you've got your truckload of corn, you'd want to sell it at the market and sell it at the granary or whatnot, and you get the price whatever is out there. So for example, if you want to sell it for a higher price, the granary will not purchase it. They just wouldn't do it because the price is what the price is, and that's all there is to it. However, if you were to sell it for a lower price, the granary would of course buy it. But you're not doing what? You're not covering your opportunity cost. You're not covering your cost to do business, really, is what it comes down to. And this is the underlying part of this is that when we talk about the invisible hand of competition, this is why it works so well when we were looking at perfect competition. The invisible hand of competition is what? Is that if you are a supplier, if you're a firm, and you want to stay in business, for example, you have to be competitive with your other competitors. You can't raise prices. You raise prices, especially in perfect competition, you're not going to sell any of the product that you want to sell. And this is the complete manifestation of that idea of the invisible hand. You're working in your own self-interest for the betterment of society. You are, in an equity manner, you are not getting more than your opportunity cost level of compensation for the goods and services that you're producing. But at the same time, you're producing the maximum number of goods and services for society. This is, again, the manifestation of that invisible hand in toto. So a major takeaway from this is that regardless of the market structure, whether we're talking about perfect competition or the other end of the spectrum, monopoly, the firm is always trying to maximize profits. And the profit maximizing price is always where, again, we said this before, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Again, no matter what the market structure. So that point is where we go to determine our pricing. The way we arrive at that profit maximizing price is to where marginal revenue, marginal cost cross, and you go up to the average revenue curve and then over to the price line. And the profit maximizing quantity is you go down to the quantity starting from that where marginal revenue cuts marginal cost, and you drop that from that point down to the quantity axis, or the x-axis, the horizontal axis, okay? So this, again, for the individual firm, determination of the price is simply based on the overall market price. Whatever that market price is at, again, when we're talking about perfectly competitive firms, that is the price structure, the price, if you will, for the individual firm, because they are, again, what? Price takers. So again, regardless of the market structure, the objective is to maximize your profits, profit maximization. Remember, that's where the marginal revenue crosses the marginal cost, where that point where they cross one another. So as long as revenue is sufficient, this is looking at a short run, so long as revenue is sufficient to more than cover variable cost, or just cover variable cost, you'll continue to operate in the short run. In order to operate in the long run, revenues must cover all costs, including both fixed in the short run and variable cost. Remember that all costs are variable in the long run. And this is illustrated even further if you think about it in terms of what I just said, and that is that in the long run, in the short run, so long as you're covering the cost of your labor, for example, then you keep operating. But if we're looking at the long run, in order to remain open, you have to be able to do what? You have to recover your variable costs for sure, and on top of that, you have to cover your fixed cost, and then some. But you get the idea. You have to cover both of those costs, both your variable costs, the cost of your labor, for example, and you also have to be able to pay for the rent. In the long run, in order to be viable, you have to cover all those costs. That's why we say that all costs in the long run are variable, because that's what we're really focusing on. So if you cannot cover your variable costs in the short run, you shut down, since losses will be greater if operated than if you actually shut down, right? If you can't pay for your people, then what's the point? You go ahead and shut down. If you can't pay for, if you can pay for your people, but you can't pay for your for your labor costs, but you can't pay your rent, for example. When I say you can't pay your rent, you're not covering your rent so far as your operating expenses. You can't meet your operating expense rent, for example. You still remain in business because you're hoping that you're going to pick up more business. And regardless, even if you were to shut down in the short run, if you would still have to pay for that fixed cost. Okay, so just to kind of keep that in mind. In the long run, then, if revenues are still not sufficient to cover all costs, and since the long run costs are all variable, you will shut down. So keeping, again, with that in mind, if revenues are sufficient to cover variable costs short run and all costs in the long run, at what level will you operate to maximize profits? So first off, remember, normal operating cost profits are also considered a cost. Remember, profits, normal profits, are considered a cost in economics, and they would be included under that cost curve. So profits greater than the normal or opportunity cost levels are surplus profits, or economic rent, or producer surplus, however you want to look at it. So in the short run, if revenue is greater than variable cost, you remain open. In the long run, revenue is greater than total cost, meaning both your variable cost and your fixed cost, in order to remain open. So in looking at our graphs, we see the market curve, and the market being represented on the left, with a typical demand curve sloping downward to the right, supply curve, of course, sloping upward to the right. For the individual firm, what we see is that our demand curve is actually flat, it's horizontal. It also represents what? Our revenue curve, or average revenue curve. So this is, again, indicating when we talk about perfectly competitive firms being price takers rather than price makers. So we're looking at the long-term equilibrium, their ease of entry or exit, where individual firms are just too small to affect market prices. We do have, again, looking at long-term equilibrium, we meet the efficiency criteria that per capita standard of living is maximized. You're getting the biggest bang for the buck, if you will. So you're getting the maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price. We also, which is where price is equal to marginal cost, and marginal cost is at a minimum. Likewise, when we look at equity, the equity conditions, the average cost is equal to average revenue at that point, and also all costs, including opportunity cost, are under that average cost curve line. So here we are moving on to consumer surplus. Again, if you study the following graph, and we'll be showing that shortly, we're looking at a typical graph that would be associated with something like OPEC, oil producing exporting countries, and the impact that they have upon oil prices, crude oil prices in particular, oil that's being pumped out of the ground. Okay, so first we'll note that the triangle for the straight line demand curve, we're just using that as just for example's sake, if you will. With its base as the perpendicular line from the price axis A to B, next the line segment of the demand curve from where it meets the supply curve up to the price axis, so moving back upward to the price axis. So first, let's start fresh again. So note the triangle. It's from the base of the perpendicular line from over to the price axis, and the next line segment of the demand curve from where it meets the supply curve up to the price axis. So it moves back up to the y-axis, the price axis. Lastly, we have the price axis back down once again to that equilibrium price, forming that triangle. This area, again, bounded by the price line, the demand curve, and the y-axis. This represents consumer surplus. The buyers, or consumers in this case, expend an amount equal to the price times the quantity demanded. That's that would be the revenue. This is also, again, total revenue going to the firm. That rectangle, if you will, below the price line. So price times quantity is equal to revenue. This revenue will then be used to pay all expenses, so on and so forth. And whatever's left over is called the profit in an accounting sense. So the triangle we've called the consumer surplus. Remember that portion above the price line, that triangle that was formed above the price line, bounded by the y-axis and the demand curve, represents an estimate of additional expenditures that consumers would pay if they had to in order to acquire the equilibrium quantity, if it were at a higher level, if you will. So note, in more advanced theory, such potential revenue represented by the consumer surplus could be expropriated or taken away by the firm using a technique called price discrimination. If the firm is not able to do so, the consumer surplus stays with the consumer. Note in the example where OPEC shifts the price from $20 a barrel to to $30 a barrel of crude oil, the consumer surplus would shrink significantly. The consumer would pay more, receive less. There are further implications of deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is taken away from both the consumer and the producer. The result again is the loss of production. So this is the takeaway from when there is market power. Okay. So this graph represents the aforementioned what we had talked about in the previous slide, if you will. And again, this is indicative of the producer surplus, where we've got the consumer surplus is in the green shaded area, and the producer surplus is the red area. And by shifting the supply curve from S1 to S2, reducing supply in effect, where the firm, or in this case, the OPEC, for example, are able to what? Increase revenue, right? That's what it's all about. So raising the price from $50 a barrel to $70 a barrel, not 20 to 30, but 50 to 70, they're able to expropriate, take more from the consumer than would otherwise be the case if it was more competitive, if they did not have as much market power. So there are impacts, income distribution implications. Remember, when we talk about producer surplus, those revenues, if you will, the producer surplus, who does it flow through to? It starts at the firm, but it ends up at the household as owners of those productive resources, whether we're talking about labor, entrepreneurship, capital, or land, or any combination thereof. So everyone, on the other hand, is a consumer. So when you're paying higher consumer prices, that harms who? Harms everyone. So not everyone is a productive resources, nor do productive resources possess the same quality and quantity of resources. So this is the takeaway. So to the extent that the economic rent or surplus rewards in excess of opportunity cost is shifted to the consumer surplus by competitive market pressures, the income distribution is less unequal, it's more equal than it would have been otherwise. So what we're saying is that competitive forces, when we have competitive forces, when we're increasing the consumer surplus, reducing the producer surplus, the net impact is that we are doing what? We're making that income distribution more equal. We're taking away some of that producer surplus. So this is a very, very key thing to keep in mind. So once again, to kind of reiterate what we're talking about when we're looking at that, when we're talking about perfectly competitive markets, what you notice again is that demand curve is also what? The average revenue curve. It's also the marginal revenue curve, because remember, the marginal revenue curve is 1/2 the distance, if you will, from the demand curve or the average revenue curve and the y-axis. Since the average revenue curve is horizontal, flat, then marginal revenue curve shares the same space. And again, it is also what? The price curve. So all costs, including again opportunity cost, profits are under the average cost curve. So equity is again, the average cost is equal to average revenue, and efficiency is again where price is equal to marginal cost, and average cost is at a minimum. So the difference between equity and equality, of course, is as follows. We've talked about it, I think, a bit, but kind of go over it one more time. Equality is very straightforward. Everyone gets the same. Whereas equity is that you are going to be receiving according to your to the productive resources that you provide. So if your labor has a lot of human capital invested in it, for example, whether we're talking about school, or you can throw a fastball at a 100-mile-an-hour fastball or a curveball or what have you, with accuracy, chances are that's going to be worth more to society than if you don't have some of those abilities, some of those skills. And I shouldn't even have said anything about baseball, but you get the idea, is that you're being compensated according to the quality of productive resource, or the quantity, I guess you could say too, but certainly the quality of your productive resource that you're providing, whether we're talking about labor, entrepreneurship, capital, or land. That is how you are compensated. You're compensated for that. So at present, do we have income equality? No. Do we have an equitable income distribution? No, we do not. So the takeaway from this is, if we were more in line with perfect competition, that would preclude firms from taking excess profits, taking producer surplus, taking economic rent, and paying it back through that income distribution to the owners of those productive resources at a higher rate than otherwise would be the case in a more competitive environment. So that kind of closes the loop, hopefully, but we'll be talking more about this as we go forward. So here we are again, perfectly competitive firms, equity and efficiency, theoretical welfare economics. I've mentioned this term before, but we'll go over it again. So if it raises price, that we're talking about a firm that sells no units, since the demand curve is horizontal to the quantity axis and perpendicular to the price axis. The firm can sell all it wants at the equilibrium price, so it would simply reduce its revenue when it reduces its price, and it would be foolish to do so. Yes, you could sell all of your corn if you sold below the market price, but you would not only be foolish, you would be out of business before too long. So again, since it's illogical to either raise or lower prices, it has no price power. It will simply produce the quantity that maximizes profit. In the long run, profit maximizing price results in the required rewards to all resources at their opportunity cost level. So the market price will maximize the consumer surplus, again, subject to the constraint that all productive resources employed in the market will receive their opportunity cost. No more, no less. So this meaning of equity in welfare economics. Concurrently, the equilibrium price will be equal to the firm's minimum average cost, and the market price will also be equal to each firm's marginal cost. Remember that all costs now, including profits, will be just equal to their opportunity cost level. No more, no less. These two conditions of price being equal to each firm's minimum average cost, and those prices being equal to each firm's marginal cost, are what is meant by the term efficiency. Perfectly competitive markets bring about the microeconomic conditions of both efficiency and equity. All right? So it's a thing of beauty. Are we there? No, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be moving in that direction. Just one last final word on that. So now we're talking about increasing competition. So now we're moving toward that perfect competition. We're not there, obviously, but we're moving toward that perfect competition, and we're talking about flattening the demand curve. The firm's demand curve is rotating, in this case, toward the horizontal, reducing the firm's price power, so moving it more from price maker to price taker, and the price elasticity of demand as a result is increasing at each price, thus reducing the revenue-enhancing result of price increases. The takeaway from this is that as the demand curve flattens out, as the number of firms increases, as the demand curve again flattens, becomes more horizontal, the price elasticity of that demand increases. So if you have a flatter demand curve and you raise prices, you're going to lose a lot more in terms of product that you would be selling than would otherwise be the case. Okay, there would be a lot less demanded of that product. So the limiting case when it reaches perfect competition is a flat demand curve, again, horizontal to the quantity axis and perpendicular to the price axis, horizontal to the x-axis and perpendicular to the price axis, the y-axis, at the level of the equilibrium market price. This has been the plight of the formerly big three in the U.S. automotive market. A little bit awkward, but the idea here is that in the past, so just to kind of put it in the proper framework, going back 50, 60 years ago, the U.S. auto and the big three comprised, they had about 90–95% of the domestic market so far as sales were concerned. And of that, General Motors had about a 60% share. So they were huge, absolutely enormous. Today, we're looking at a big three, the traditional big three being General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler being much less than 50%, even probably around the 45% range. So they're much, much smaller. So what's happened is that the demand curve has went down what? It's flattened out significantly. Substitution effect is come into play, of course, because we have many more what? Many more suppliers out there so far as automotives are concerned. Between the Japanese, the Koreans, the U.S., Germans, throw French in there. Yes, French too, yes. At any rate, you get the idea is that we're talking about many, many substitutes. So as the demand curve flattens, markets become more competitive, the market moves toward a more perfectly competitive one. So it's not to say that the auto industry is perfectly competitive. No, far from it, but it is much more so than it has been in the past. So here are a couple of ways of looking at the substitution effect, if you will. One is that when we're talking about increases in supply and quantity supplied. So if we increase the number of suppliers out there, we're shifting in this case from S1 to S2, we're shifting rightward. And of course, what that means is that the price goes down. The price would be going down so far as relative to the demand curve. Ceteris paribus, the demand curve is not shifting, just the supply is shifting. So the price of those goods go down, and what happens to the quantity demand? It increases as well. So we get price going down. I shouldn't say as well, but prices going down, and law of demand, of course, says that if price goes down, then the quantity demand is going to increase. So this is the substitution effect in terms of bringing more competitors into the mix, if you will. Secondly, if we're looking at price, that substitution effect in terms of the demand curve itself flattening out, the way we look at it in terms of like this price elasticity on the right-hand side, it's pretty straightforward. So we have a steeper demand curve. We find out where that midpoint or the unit elastic point is at. And so it's at that point that you're maximizing your revenue, right? So price times quantity. So what happens if that demand curve flattens out? Demand curve flattens out. What happens is that midpoint shifts. It goes further down that demand curve or that average revenue curve. And as a result of which, what happens at your price is that your prices are above the unitary elastic point with that shifted demand curve. And so in order to increase your revenue, to maximize your revenue, what do you have to do? You have to reduce price down to that, again, to that midpoint or that unitary elastic point. So again, we're talking about the short run versus long run. We've seen pictures of this before, but or we've talked about it before. So because in the short run, you're minimizing losses. If it's shut down, its losses would be greater. They would be equal to all the fixed costs instead of the fixed cost less the excess of the revenue less the variable cost. Meaning that in the short run, again, so long as you can cover your variable cost and maybe $1 or more, you remain open, is really all that we're saying. But in the long run, this is indicated here. If we don't cover all of our costs, then we shut down. This is, again, an example of it, the picture of it. So revenue minus variable cost is equal to contribution margin. The contribution margin is the part that you're actually covering your fixed cost. So the break even is the contribution margin minus your fixed cost. So the two combined, you have to reach zero. So if you're starting out with $10,000 revenue minus your variable cost of $5,000, per unit produced, then your CM or your contribution margin is at $5,000, just the difference between the two. So the break-even point is where the $5,000 contribution margin less that is the same, if you will, as that $5,000 fixed cost. So this is usually represented in units produced or total cost. So anyway, we'll talk more about that in a bit, but the takeaway from this again is that when we talk about, to kind of reiterate, when we talk about normal profits, this is something that people have trouble with all the time. And I just wanted to bring it back up here, talk about it for just a minute. And that is that normal profits, when we talk about normal profits being under the cost curve, what we're saying in an economic sense, the difference between an economic sense and accounting sense. In accounting sense, profit is its revenue minus expense is equal to profit. And in an economic sense, profit is, or normal profits would be counted as part of your cost. And when we talk about cost, it's your opportunity cost. Remember, opportunity cost is what? Opportunity cost is your next best competitive option. So long as you're covering your opportunity cost, just your opportunity cost, then your normal profit would be embedded in that. If you're receiving more than your opportunity cost level of compensation, then you're receiving economic rent or producer surplus. If you're receiving less, then get out of business. Anyway, you get the idea. Okay, so moving on to monopolistic competition or imperfect competition. These were ginned up, put together by two different economists. They're both English, both British. So monopolistic competition was coined by Joan Robinson, and it was about the same time, I believe, probably in the 1930s. I have to kind of relook at that, but you get the idea. It was quite a while ago, 70, 80 years ago anyway. Takeaway again is that it was called the Tangency Solution, and we're talking about downward sloping demand curves in general. So this is not perfect competition. And again, Edward Chamberlain, it's imperfect competition, or again, as it's the term we use, it's monopolistic competition. Actually, imperfect competition is probably a little more, appropriate, accurate, or whatever. But for whatever reason, we've kind of most people refer to this as monopolistic competition. It's also called the Tangency Solution. And what we looking at our graph here, what we notice is that when we talk about the tangency solution, we're saying it's where your average cost touches your average revenue curve. So remember, we're trying to maximize, we're looking at what? Profit maximizing price, profit maximizing quantity. So it is, again, we arrive at that by where marginal revenue cuts marginal cost. And if we take the line up, going up to the average revenue curve and over to the price line, that's where we arrive at our profit maximizing price. And dropping down from where marginal revenue cuts marginal cost, that's our profit maximizing quantity. And what we notice is that that average cost curve touches at that same spot so far as where that profit maximizing price occurs. So again, the average cost touches the average revenue, and that is what we talk about with equity, right? Average cost is equal to average revenue, but it's not at a minimum, so it's not efficient. So we have the equity condition, meaning that the productive resources being employed receive their opportunity cost level of compensation, but the consumers are paying a bit higher and they're receiving a little bit less than they would otherwise, or some number less than they would otherwise be achieving. So we're seeing the marginal cost again is where it's equal to marginal revenue. That's our profit maximization point. So kind of keep this in mind, that we have equity, and our example for monopolistic competition was fast food. So fast food they don't pay a lot. You're not getting much, if at all, in the way of what? Being compensated more than your opportunity cost level. So that case, it's equity. The criteria for equity is met. But the criteria for efficiency is not met because you're being paid a bit more than you would otherwise be paid. So restating this again, when we talk about monopolistic competition and perfect competition, monopolistic competition coming from Joan Robinson, it's also called the Tangency Solution. And Edward Chamberlain with the imperfect competition, same Same exact concept. But anyway, the takeaway is that at the very bottom here, this is profits are maximized, but only normal at their opportunity cost level, and no economic rent profit occurs. Again, normal or opportunity cost levels are below the cost curves. The idea, what we're getting at here, is that we meet the conditions of equity. And so this is the takeaway, is that we're operating where profit maximization occurs, where that marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, and where it goes up to the price, up to the demand curve, average revenue curve, and that is where the tangency, that point where average cost curve touches that average revenue curve. So they are equal. Again, that is where where the land of equity is, if you will. But again, we do not have. We are violating efficiency. When we're talking about monopolistic competition. At any rate, just wanted to show that again. So our example of monopolistic competition or imperfect competition would be fast food, where there's some product differentiation and consumers are willing to pay a bit more for it. Just a real quick example would be something on the order of, again, fast food, Wendy's versus McDonald's. And if there is a premium at Wendy's, I'm not sure about that, but there's a distinction. There is some differentiation in terms of the shape of the hamburger, right? So the Wendy's got a square hamburger versus a round hamburger at McDonald's. You get the idea. There's not much differentiation, but there is enough to distinguish between the competitors. And the idea is that they're charging a bit higher price because of that. That's what Milton Friedman is really saying. Famous economist, he's saying that we're paying for that differentiation. But the reality is, in the long run, monopolistic competition looks very much like perfect competition, because if there is some excess profit, if you will, to be made, economic rent to be made, you tend to see other fast food restaurants popping into those spaces. So you have 4 fast food restaurants at a corner, for example, a busy corner, McDonald's on one side, again, Taco Bell, Burger King, Wendy's, so all 4 corners are covered. And if you're past the point of saturation, one may go out of business. It happens. But typically what happens also is that if one goes out, then perhaps another competitor might come back in. So it's just, this is what we're saying. It behaves much in the long run. Monopolistic competition looks very, very similar to perfect competition. All right. So in the short run, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and price is greater than that average variable cost. In the long run, we have 0 profit. Again, we've got ease of entry and exit, price taker versus price maker. And again, the difference between perfect competition and monopolistic competition is that you're producing slightly less, you're restricting a bit of supply, and you're able to charge a bit more, at least in the short run. Excess capacity drives us towards 0 profits in the long run. Again, we've talked about 0 profits, we're talking about 0 economic profit, excess profit, economic rent. So Alfred Marshall was the economist that came up, of course, he was the first one to formally present the supply and demand. It goes back to an 1890 book on economics, principles of economics. At any rate, so in the short run, this is the Marshallian pseudo rent, and this is kind of explaining the differential, if you will, between explaining that economic rent or that producer surplus. Anyway, so the excess of revenue over the variable cost is what Marshall referred to as pseudo rent. So you're collecting more than that variable cost, right? Graphically, it is the vertical difference between the demand or average revenue curve and the average variable cost curve. You operate at the quantity where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect, and then it's times that quantity. New entrants into a competitive market, supply goes up, increases, prices go down due to an increase in price elasticity of demand. So again, just wanted to show that with this Marshallian pseudo rent. It is represented by the excess of revenue over the variable cost that is shown in this graphic. So an example of this, of course, would be I have the U.S. auto industry because of the because it would be representative of an oligopoly, meaning they are price makers, not price takers. So they're receiving more than that average variable cost. Okay. So again, the objective here is that when we're talking about moving more toward perfect competition, for example, shifting that supply curve, in this case, we're shifting the supply curve rightward. We're increasing supply, increasing the number of competitors out there, moving from S1 to S2 with the demand curve remaining constant, okay, ceteris paribus. So we're shifting the supply curve rightward, increasing supply. So at any rate, this is our kind of our objective in moving more toward perfect competition. So just stepping back for a moment, let's go back over this. Is that when we talk about profit in terms of in an accounting sense, we're looking at profit is equal to revenue minus expense. So it's the difference, it's the residual, whatever's left over. Profit in economics, we're really talking about normal profits included in cost. It's under that cost curve, right? So when we have, again, when we're talking about increasing supply from S1 to S2, successful product differentiation is moving the opposite way. So when we talk about successful product differentiation, the one that comes to mind, or the thing that comes to mind, is advertising. So we're trying to move in the opposite direction of that substitution effect. So rather than flattening the demand curve, we are talking about what's steepening the demand curve, or in this instance, we're talking about restricting supply. And the way that we could restrict supply is if we had market power, of course, but also through advertising, we may change people's perspective of the products, saying that one product is better than another, whereas before they may have been considered pretty much the same, so good close substitutes. So we're moving away from good close substitutes to differentiating. That's really what we're saying, which in effect is reducing supply. Anyhow. So again, successful product differentiation would be steepening the demand curve, moving this from a flatter demand curve of D1 to a steeper demand curve, rotating, if you will, on its axis, and rotating it upward. And so in that case, with the objective, of course, is that if you can successfully differentiate yourself, you are able to do what? You're able to raise price and increase your revenue. Really, that's our objective. And so on the left-hand side, it's interesting about the top advertisers in the U.S. And I saw something recently where it went country by country, the top consumer products type things, and it becomes more evident when you look at it on a national scale. Amazon being, one of the main market competitors, obviously out there so far as selling things. Period. People buying things online, etc. And traditionally in the past, and I'm not saying that long ago, P&G, Procter & Gamble, used to be at the top, and they're no longer there. And who's in front of them? This is 2019. I don't have the latest data. It's probably they've probably fallen from here too. P&G consumer items, type of things like household cleaners, personal products like shampoos, I think Pampers or Huggies or both, for all I know, things like that, and different Ivory soap. These would all be under that Procter & Gamble umbrella. And so they did lots and lots of advertising to differentiate themselves from their competitors. Interestingly enough, going back to 2008, what they found was, in the last Great Recession, if you will, that the advertising wasn't working. People were shopping more and more frequently, not by type or product brand or brand name. They were shopping by price, looking at these at store brands and so on and so forth. But again, at any rate, what's interesting is that Amazon is on top, and not by a little. $7 billion worth of advertising. You don't even think about Amazon as being an advertiser, but they are all around us on the internet, are they not? And this is in 2019. I don't have any more recent data, but I'm sure that they are at or near the top, and others have moved up, including Alphabet, which is, of course, Google. I'm sure that's higher than it was. They spent quite a bit more going forward. They have spent more. So definitionally, we've already talked about monopolistic competition and so on and so forth, imperfect competition, the types of firms and so on and so forth with the fast food establishments. So now we're moving on to oligopoly. We've talked about it a bit, but oligopoly means small. It's a small number of firms and they're acting interdependently. We'll get into what that means in a moment. They are more price makers than they are price takers. Some can be differentiated, some are homogeneous, meaning they could be producing the same exact thing, producing steel, for example, or they could be differentiated in terms of producing automobiles, but different brands of autos, right? So the other things, the barriers, if you will, the big barrier, of course, is economies of scale, meaning in order to really scale up, you have to, it takes a tremendous amount of cost, lots and lots of fixed cost in the form of production facilities. Think about it again, auto industry. You're talking about having different automobile plants, factories to do what? To assemble vehicles, to build and assemble engines, and to build and assemble transmissions, and to make frames for pickup trucks, body panels. It just, the list goes on and on and on. A very huge cost going in. So that's the high cost of entry. Startup costs are just enormous to start a new auto company, for example. It wouldn't be in the tens of millions, it would be in the tens of billions of dollars to do that. So before, when we were talking, I'll just go as long as I'm here talking, well, I'll talk about it right now, is that when we talk about interdependently, what that means is that you're interlocked in pricing. And so this is where we start talking about collusion. They're informal agreements to fix prices and to limit competition, dividing up the market. So if you've got just a handful of competitors in the market, example of which would be, let's say, General Motors and Ford. So if General Motors, again, was huge, it was the largest portion of the market out there, and if Ford wanted to compete with General Motors, they may say, okay, we'll reduce price on a car like a Mustang versus the Chevy Camaro. So reduce the price, and what does the law of demand say? If you reduce the price and the substitution effect, assuming that there are somewhat reasonable substitutes, we'll just say that, okay, ceteris paribus, people would opt to buy more Fords. And as a result of which, the market share for Ford would go up and the market share for General Motors would go down for Chevy products. Is General Motors going to sit by and let that happen? No, they will not. What will they do instead? They will say, okay, if you want to play that game, we can reduce prices too. And so there's this price wars that kind of result. And they don't end well for folks like this. They reach a point finally where ultimately what would happen is that Ford would surrender because General Motors would have had deeper pockets. Again, this is going back, but you get the idea. So this is where the collusion part comes into play. Collusion is an informal agreement to fix prices and limit competition, thusly dividing up the market. This is that interdependence that I was referring to, is that firms have an unwritten rule. I shouldn't say firms, but these corporations have firms, I guess, too, but have an unwritten rule that they will not compete beyond the normal competition. They're not going to be going after each other in a very, very competitive manner. And competitive meaning driving prices down to neither one of their benefit. A cartel is a formal collusion. So collusion is against the law. More specifically, a cartel is formal collusion. setting prices by setting production levels, for example, restricting supply. That is certainly illegal in the U.S. And does it happen? Collusion does. Is there? Does it still go? Yes, it still goes on in the U.S. Cartels are certainly against the law in the U.S. That's why OPEC, for example, oil producing, exporting countries. I think it's oil producing anyway. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. I think that's what it might be. They actually meet in Switzerland, not in the U.S. obviously. So the problem with oligopolies, with these cartels, is that they have a certain number of participants, and the more that you have, the tougher it is to keep them moving in the same direction, right? And the objective, the way that you're able to raise prices is by restricting supply. So if you have a market leader out there like a Saudi Arabia and OPEC, being able to, okay, well, they'll cut back on their production by 1 million barrels a day, or 200,000, whatever the amount is, in order to drive those prices up to where they want to be. The problem is that with these higher prices, the other countries look at this and there's a tendency, and ultimately what they do is cheat. So there are these temptations and they undermine the cartels, and this is a continuing cycle where this would be going on. So these are the problems that are associated with oligopolies, if you will. And other things that come into play would be like technology, when we're talking about fracking and diamonds, just examples. Technology has made tremendous inroads into oligopolies and monopolies for that matter. Fracking has really done a number on the domestic oil in particular, and also it's had a tremendous influence on international crude oil prices and natural gas prices in terms of increasing the supply. And the U.S. has led the major charge in doing that, to the point at which that the U.S. is virtually energy independent, or at least it has been. It had been up until probably 2021, when policy changes in government caused that to change, caused that to turn around, causing a lot of problems with the markets and higher prices for oil and for for energy in general. Diamonds, an example of the technology with diamonds is that being able to actually create diamonds artificially, and they're perfect, absolutely perfect diamonds. That's one of the reasons that you know that it's a manufactured diamond, is that there are no imperfections. Beyond that, at any rate, you get the idea. It's tough to block entrance, or you can block entrance, people from coming in, but ultimately you end up dealing with cheating and so on and so forth. And there's always the producer surplus or economic rent that comes with an oligopoly, because they are price takers, so they can manage their demand curve. They can decrease supply, restrict supply, right? So a dominant firm, oligopoly, or non-dominant, either one. Dominant firm would be like Carnegie, U.S. Steel, where they had 80% of the market share in steel in the U.S. in the 1950s. GM, of course, had the same in terms of the auto industry. They had 95% of all domestic auto sales, or auto sales in the U.S. Just as an aside, there were two main folks that were involved with this. One was Will Durant. He was on the business side in terms of running the company. He was the engineer versus Alfred P. Sloan, and he was the financier. He was the money guy coming out of New York, Wall Street. So let's walk through oligopolies again, how they actually behave, and in the real world, if you will. And again, this is representation of it on the right-hand side, where they control supply. They control supply via restricting supply. And when they do that successfully, meaning as a group, restricting supply, they manage to do what? They manage to raise prices. They manage to increase profits, and that's what they're really all about. So They, of course, are increasing their producer surplus. They already have a significant amount of economic rent or producer surplus, but when they're able to restrict that supply, driving the prices higher, they're able to actually increase their ill-gotten gains, if you will, without being too preachy. Exercise their market power, exercise their price power. And the reason I'm saying this in such a negative manner is that the problem is, of course, yes, it's nice to see companies do well and so on and so forth. But the reality is that when they're able to raise prices, when they're able to avoid competition, the reality is that the consumer ends up paying for it, ends up paying higher prices, if you will. And in addition to that, what you'll notice is that the welfare loss, the deadweight loss that's associated with that restricting supply, you're actually reducing the amount that's being produced. You're reducing the consumer surplus for sure, reducing producer surplus as well, but it matters not a whit to the producer because they end up gaining with that added producer surplus piece. At any rate, this is just another kind of an explanation of what goes on with oligopolies, how they actually operate.